Hello and welcome to the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by George Bell. George, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing?
Lewis, good, thank you. Great to be here and thanks for having me.
Good. It's been one that I have wanted to do for a very long time, so I'm super excited to get into this and have the conversation with you. But George, as always, in your own words, what makes you a man?
Yeah, I think also, by the way, thanks for... We've been trying to get this date working for a while, so hopefully it's a good one. But yeah, I think for me, maybe a slightly frustrating definition, but also the one that feels true for me and it hopefully works for other people, that being my own definition of a man is what makes me a man and what works for me. And, again, I know that sounds really loose and frustrating, but actually I think so many of the issues we get into, which I'm sure we will come into on this podcast, comes from the fact that we try to force men into these small boxes. Like there's a sort of 5-point blueprint checklist, like, tick those 5 and you're a man, quote unquote. And I think we almost get conditioned into that. And I think a lot of men, I speak from experience here, run into troubles trying to fit into that box and or that checklist. And actually, you can end up in great struggle where who you actually are and who you want to be doesn't align with this society's blueprint, and you're at conflict with yourself there. So I think for me, that's the main thing I've had to get comfortable with over my life, is being comfortable with who I am. But I think rather than pinning 10 values on a wall of this is what being a man means to me, it's kind of broader than that, and it's just living the life that I want to live. So seeing the people that I want to see, watching the TV that I want to watch, having the hobbies that I want to have. That, I love gaming, for example. A lot of people slap a nerdy sticker on that and say that's not what men should be doing. I disagree, because it's what I want to do. I support men and men's rights. I support females' rights. I feel like I live a balanced life. I make mistakes. I learn from them. I'm comfortable with my emotions. I know, or at least I feel like I know when to share them. I also know when to lean on maybe traditional traits of strength and resilience and stoicism and whatever. So I think really that for me is my definition of being a man, just living how I know feels right to me and doing the things that feel good to me, not for anyone else, and not to sort of have this perception of being a man to society, but just because those are the things that I want to do.
I think the reason that I asked that question is for that answer. That is the textbook answer that I want. It might not be the textbook answer of what society says is a man, but yeah, I think it's a really powerful place to be in. And as you mentioned, we will definitely get into sort of how you got there, because it's definitely not an easy place to get to, for sure. That is one thing that is very apparent. So, George, why don't you just tell everyone a little bit about what it is that you're sort of doing right now in and around the men's space?
Yes, for sure. So I guess right now I'm writing a book on men's mental health and masculinity, masculinity as a whole. And I think the short summary of why I've ended up here is that I had a real struggle with my mental health about 10, 11 years ago. You sort of lose count when it hits double digits, but it was definitely over a decade ago. And yeah, I ended up in a really bad place. I was in a really, really bad way. Depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, had to quit my job, was barely leaving the house. It was just I was in a real crisis, to be honest. It was a real dark place. And I think part of that was so challenging because of my lack of education and awareness around mental health, particularly mental health issues. I didn't even know I had mental health up until that point, which is, it's just bonkers. I was 21, 22, and that was my kind of rude awakening that, not only do I have mental health, but I have mental health issues as well now. So I think that was one part of it. But actually, as I started to come to terms with that and then go through the recovery journey and go to therapy and do all the inner work and all that kind of stuff, what kept coming up for me was my sense of identity and my sense of being a man and masculinity. And actually, when I was bullied at school for how I was quite a sensitive kid. I didn't like football. I was kind of scared of women back then. I was kind of scared of girls, as I'm sure a lot of people are. But I wasn't a very confident boy, which isn't how you're told to be a man, right? And your sense of social status at school is based on how well you can kick a football, at least in the UK. And because I didn't do any of that, I didn't really fit in. So I was bullied for that, and I think that. Again, I didn't realize this at the time, but you carry that stuff with you. You carry those kind of emotional scars with you, so that as I was getting older, my sense of being a man felt wrong and felt misaligned to how I was told I should be. So I ended up in this crisis really. And I think when I first started to try and tackle the mental health issues, I did it in a very typical bloke way, kind of like this very linear mindset, like DIY. I was using quite like combative language. Like I was like, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to attack it. And, I just saw it as a really simple equation. Like, I have mental health issues, I'll take some antidepressants and that will solve it. It's very, very linear mindset with it. And actually, the more and more I got into it, I realized how much of my identity and sense of being a man and history was really contributing to these issues. And that was something I was going to have to work on. And I'm not the finished article. I don't think any of us ever are, but that really has been the core of my journey really for the last 10 years is working on myself as a man. I've worked in the mental health space now for about 10 years as well. Done work with charities and most recently working in some workplace wellbeing startups. So I've been in and around the space for a while, the mental health space more broadly, but it is really the men's piece in it that interests me the most. So that's why I've ended up at this book basically. And yeah, I think I'm really writing the book for George 10 years ago. That's the person I'm sort of holding in my mind. I think it can be easy. I don't know how you feel, but it can be easy sort of having been in this industry for quite a long time that, you feel a bit more self-aware, quote unquote, enlightened, whatever you want to say. And it can be easy to start sort of talking about, I just need to be more present and mindful and do meditation. And I put all that out of my mind and just reminded myself what the Georgia 10 years ago was like, that he'd not even heard the word meditation before, and actually he was stuck in a really difficult place. And yeah, that's what I've written the book for. And I just want to basically introduce a kind of more healthier idea of masculinity, not one that tells people how they should live. I don't believe in that. I don't believe men, are broken and need to be fixed. I don't believe they should live in a certain way. I don't believe in this kind of battle between two sides of traditional masculinity versus this sort of new wave. Some people are calling the bro-naissance, which I quite like as a word. I don't believe in that. I just believe in, it's a spectrum that we can all operate within. And I want to, I think rather than change men and change their sense of masculinity, just sort of expand their view and bring in other parts really. So that's what the project is.
Amazing. Some of the sort of the spectrum of masculinity is really interesting, but yet you still talk about that sort of like solution-based approach to a lot of sort of men's issues. That's just sort of how we go about it. I guess sort of based on the people you've spoken to and your own sort of background and what you went through, why do you think men are so solution orientated?
I think these are some of like the age old questions that unfortunately there's no clear answer to, but I think there is a combination of, and this is what I found with a lot of stuff in the book, there's a combination of biological predetermination and wiring that we're dealing with here. So I think when you hear phrases like boys will be boys, or, be a man about it, or man up, or whatever, they're often well-intentioned. They have completely the wrong, they land very badly. But often there actually is a bit of truth to it, that we are biologically wired towards certain things. But there's a huge piece of social conditioning in here as well, and cultural norms that are kind of forced onto us. And I think we don't know clearly as society as a whole where the line is for that. And I think we just lump everything into biological wiring and just say, that's just how men are meant to be. So I think there probably is some, biological leanings for men that have a sort of solutions mindset. However, that doesn't mean that's the whole man, because when I first approached therapy, I went for the very, very solutions orientated one. I went for cognitive behavioral therapy. It's all about, present day actions and behaviors, change how you act, change how you think, change how you feel. And I was like, perfect. It's 6 sessions. You come away with loads of tools. I was like, that's the one for me. Later on, I had to go to something that was more exploratory and, past looking and childhood and trauma, all that kind of stuff. That's very like messy and, not clear and linear. But I was able to do it, and that was able to help me a lot. So I think, that just proves that men can operate across both spectrums. I think we just often maybe lean towards the solutions side of things. And I think part of that is emotional suppression. I think we've been conditioned from a really young age to suppress our emotions, and that's often why we can jump straight to solutions. I spoke to a relationship coach, and one of the kind of conflicts they find in relationships is, I'm talking about heterosexual relationships here between a man and a woman, where a woman might come to the man with a problem and the man jumps straight to solutions. And then the woman actually gets really angry at him or annoyed at him. She's not looking for solutions. She's just looking to live in that emotion for a bit and be supported. The man thinks he's being supportive by trying to give solutions. So they just sort of miss each other there. And you can see how women find it easier to operate within the emotion. Men prefer to operate in these sort of, this ground of like logic and reason.
I agree with that. I think for me, I'm yet to do therapy. It's something that I am now considering. So I've been doing this for about 3 years, and you mentioned sort of like the more nitty gritty childhood trauma kind of in the guts kind of therapy. And that's probably the stuff that I'm considering doing. For me, though, I feel like it's taken me this long to get to that consideration point. Do you maybe look back at George from 10 years ago and see that the journey that you went on required you to sort of get through that sort of solution stage? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. So if I think about the time it took, so I struggled with mental health around 21, and then I think I did the typical man's thing of doing nothing about it for about a year. So then I went to CBT when I was 22, and I deliberately picked that one because of the solutions focus of it, which did help a lot, in combination with a bunch of other stuff. And then it was probably 5 years later, maybe, that certain stuff was starting to resurface. And by this point, I'd worked in the space. So, I guess that sort of fast tracked my knowledge with this stuff. And that's when I was like, I probably need to do something a little bit deeper here. And I did. And it was tough, but it was so rewarding. It was kind of critical to me moving through a lot of stuff. But really that took 5-6 years, and fast tracked by me being in the space. So yeah, I think with any of this stuff, even if it's not therapy, even if we're talking about anything else, going to the doctors or whatever it might be, I think that obviously if you're in a really serious kind of condition or illness or something, then obviously you do need to seek medical help. But I think when it's something where you're looking to work on yourself, therapy or meditation, whatever it might be, I don't sort of believe in telling people you must go and do that, because you have to be ready for it. I think the George from 10 years ago wouldn't have been ready for that deep exploration into childhood. Part of any of this stuff is you have to be ready for it, and that's where the magic happens.
There's a lot of talk around therapy and coaching and these sort of things not being built for men. Obviously, you've been in the space, in and around the space, and obviously been through it yourself for, like you say, just over a decade now. What have you seen change? What shifts have you seen? Or do you still feel like maybe as a whole, therapy for men is probably a little outdated or just not hitting the mark?
It's a really, really good question. And again, I think frustrated with a lot of this stuff, no clear solution, right? But I do think that generally the system is not set up for men and doesn't support men. Just at a basic level, like if you look at the percentage of female therapists to male therapists, I don't have the exact numbers, but it's heavily weighted towards female therapists. So there's just a massive lack of male therapists around. There's also stats that show that, again, I haven't got the exact number, it's in my book somewhere, but a number of men who have taken their own life did so after actually engaging with some frontline services. So I think it's a common myth that all these people that take their own lives, all these men, they just never reached out for help, whereas actually some have reached out for help and have still taken their own life. So clearly in that experience, something has been missing for them. And I think there is a lot of stuff to that, right? Like practically, as we said, more female therapists than male, but also there's a lot of stuff around stigma and shame and, this emotional suppression piece we talked about. I think, men find it harder to present to these places. They find it harder to open up. So there is a lot of stuff at play with this. It's not just the case of, oh, well, let's just hire a load more male therapists and we'll be good to go. Because in a lot of cases, particularly men who might be mid-50s, they've been living with potentially 5 decades of baggage and emotional suppression, and it's not just a kind of a light that you can switch on. But I think there are definitely spaces that are working. There are groups out there that are getting traction. Andy's Man Club is one I've spoken for the book, who's brilliant. They're a suicide prevention charity. They have kind of like men's circles. Men come there and basically share what's been going on for them and how they're doing. I think they're in over 250 locations around the UK now. you just wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't working, right? So they are scaling. So I think that men do want spaces. They want a space. It might not always be therapy. It could be, hikes, walking groups, football communities, whatever it might be. But they do want spaces to connect. And often you will find that men do want to talk and open up. And they might not always know exactly how to or what the right words are. And maybe therapy isn't always the right place. But I think, we definitely are at a bit of a tension point at the moment where I think, generally speaking, more men are realizing they might need support in some way. And I think they're coming up against a system which, again, generally speaking, isn't as set up for them as it is for their female counterparts, perhaps.
Yeah, it's really, so just sort of touching on a lot of what you've already said, which is like this spectrum of masculinity, and then also, I guess, sort of the boxes in which these things are built for a solution. Like, what is your sort of viewpoint on, I guess, people that aren't really moving with these times and not really wanting to sort of consider it or do anything like that, and then just sort of those men are sort of labeled as toxic, or they are not right. They're not right. They're bottling it up. They're not wanting to speak. Have you managed to speak to any men around that, or like, what's your sort of views on that stance?
Yeah, it's a really, really good one to raise, I think, because this is where some of the conversation around masculinity has just got unnecessarily divisive, and people are labeled toxic. Personally, I don't like the phrase toxic masculinity. I've kind of sparred with some people on this online. I think it has, it's probably started with good intentions. I think it's been weaponized. I think it's overused now. And for example, men who, perhaps aren't as comfortable expressing their emotions or don't want to, can quite quickly be labeled toxic. And I think, the purpose of this and the purpose of what I'm trying to do isn't to suddenly get every single man opening up and crying and singing about his trauma from the rooftops or anything like that, because I don't think that's what people should do. They should do what is right for them.
Yeah.
I think it's just about encouraging them that if they want to do that, they can. And then it's their choice. If they say, you know what, I don't want to go to therapy, I don't want to talk about my emotions, fine. But as long as they're saying, I'm doing that for me, versus I'm doing that because that's what I think I should do based on what society has told me, that I think we have to push back on, because that's just super, super unhelpful. And there's a lot of research out there, a lot of science that shows that, if you don't just, if you bat your emotions away, they don't just go. It's the same with, trauma, struggle, pain, whatever it might be. There's a really, really good book called The Body Keeps the Score, which goes into this in more detail. But essentially, the premise of that is that anything you go through, any struggle, pain, mental health issues, whatever it might be, if you don't deal with that and process that, the body will store it, and it will build like a pressure cooker. And I think what I found with some of the research from my book is often where that pressure cooker comes out is in things like addictions, violence, domestic abuse, loneliness, suicide even. So I think that it is really, really important that we do encourage men to find a way of processing the things they're going through. It doesn't mean they have to start telling everyone about their life story, but they do have to find a way of sitting with their emotions and finding a way of processing that. And it's not always therapy. I've spoken to an amazing group who they're called Man vs. Fat. They're a weight loss community, and they basically all get together and they play football games. They've got a league table, and it's all around losing weight. But what happens underneath the surface is you've got a bunch of men who come together, connect, end up talking about stuff, end up processing stuff, and meeting some of the community. You can hear how amazing it's been for them. So, and that's so far removed from therapy, right? Kicking a football around a field. So I think it is important we do find ways of processing this stuff, and how that works for each person is different.
Do you think it's harder to be a man now with all this choice, or do you think it's easier to just say, you know what, I'm just going to be stoic and I'm just going to be a man and I'm going to just stick with that?
It's a great question. One that I've not been asked before. I think I'm going to go with my gut. My first feeling is that it's harder now. And that could be my own bias, right? Because I live right now. So it's easier for me to say, well, I've got it tougher than, my granddad, although he went through World War or whatever it might be. But I think that, we can almost, with anything, right? Not just masculinity, but with anything, you can get into kind of analysis paralysis or paralysis of choice. We have so much choice now. We've got, we're probably looking at least 3 screens a day: phone, laptop, TV, maybe your iPad, 7 different social media platforms, algorithms that follow you everywhere, news flashes. You've got a lot of strong voices on both sides telling you to be this way, to be that way. Very influential voices as well. And I think particularly if you get people who are in a vulnerable situation or space, they're kind of like sponges. It's much easier to take these messages on. So yeah, I mean, look, I can't speak for men decades ago or before that, but I do know it is a very, very challenging time to be right now, particularly as there's been a lot of, the rise of feminism in recent years, and female empowerment has grown, female equality. They've also had one sort of unifying message to rally around, which is that female empowerment. What it's meant for men is their position in society and their place is changing. We can argue that's good or bad, but it is changing. They've not been given that clear message to rally around in the same way that the females have. So I think it's just a very confusing time. They're losing that place. They're being told to be this way, that way. Maybe they don't have the self-awareness to fully know what way they should be. And it's just like a cauldron of noise, really.
Yeah, I think that cauldron of noise is definitely true. I think there's so many more pressures, like you say, rise of feminism and what that means for men and boys, and then also the additional pressure of now you have to open up and be a good dad, and also still provide and get a good job and be physically fit and flipping high, like there's a High Rocks, Ironman, marathon. All of these need to be done in your 30s at a solid time. So yeah, it's a weird one. I really like the saying that it's the best time to be a man because you can do anything. But if you're so unaware of like being able to be yourself, it is like you say, you're just being pulled from pillar to post, and you're like, you just don't know where to settle. So yeah, it'd be really good to maybe just sort of slowly get into how you start to find yourself in the world. Like, what are some of the things that you sort of started to do, and how you started to position yourself to just feel more comfortable in your own skin?
Yeah. So I guess for me, it took a real crisis. I mean, if you tried to tell George before that to work on his self-awareness, like, I would have laughed at you. So it did take a crisis for me, which is a shame, because I think that's often how we deal with things, right? We wait till they're bad, and then we are very, very reactive. And then it's meant that I went through therapy, and I appreciate people might not be ready to just jump straight into therapy, but I think some of the things that I wish I had probably known back then and been taught back then, I mean, the first, maybe one of the most important, is just pay more attention to my body, which sounds really stupid and simple, or it sounds kind of really woo-woo and fluffy, but actually our body is pretty much, or is the greatest source of information that we have in our lives, and our bodies often react to things before our thoughts have even had a chance to catch up. So you'll feel anxiety in your gut first before you've even really had time to think about it. But you'll also feel happiness and joy, elation, grief, sadness, whatever it is. You'll feel the things in your body. I just wasn't doing any of that before I had my crisis. It was like I had, my computer was flashing up warning signs at me, and I was just like, close tab, close tab, close tab. Really, I was abusing my body. I was lots of late nights, lots of drinking. I was pushing away the pain I was feeling, my mental health issues building, by going out more, by socializing more, barely sleeping, drinking. So I think I was getting some loud messages from my body, really, that stuff was off. And I think I just wish I paid more attention to it then. And that's really what I do now. I think that is probably the main thing that I do in my life to manage my mental health, is just pay attention to myself. And I'll know very quickly if something doesn't feel right. It doesn't always mean you can do something about it, right? Or it doesn't always mean you want to do something about it. I'm not kind of like, I haven't completed this. Like, I don't suddenly sort of feel something in my right finger and I know how to articulate it perfectly. But I think pay attention to it. And then I've had to get to a place of just understanding that emotions aren't good or bad. They just are. They're just natural. They're not either side. It's us as humans that have unhelpfully labeled them good or bad, and moved them into different categories. And of course, if you're really, really happy, that is a more pleasurable emotion. And if you're grieving, that gives you much more discomfort, and you would rather not have that. But I think we can get into a really bad place where we feel sad, or we're feeling grief, we might feel a bit depressed, and we label that bad, and so we ignore it rather than listen to it and understand it, and then give ourselves some compassion for feeling that way, and then try to move through it. So, yeah, I think for me, listen to the body, listen to your emotions, and understand they're not bad or good. They're just there to kind of give you a signal. And then I think really work on the male friendships in my life has been a massive thing for me, and I think really is a good place to start. Men get a lot of stick, right? We get a lot of stick as, I think, just tired stereotypes that we're lazy, we're closed off, we're emotionally inept, we can't really talk, we only do anger. Me and you know that to not be true. And I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will know that to not be true. And there's a lot of good stuff going on for men under the surface. And I think when I went through my crisis, I didn't tell anyone for a year. I think it was 13 months. Eventually I had to open up to my parents. And then even then I didn't tell my best mates for a few more months. So I think it was around month 15 since it all started that I told my best mates. And looking back, that actually feels really unfair. Like, I'm labeling them my best mates. They're meant to be, my closest mates. And I didn't even give them the opportunity to know about that and help me, because I had already assumed that they were going to dismiss me, give me shame, stigma, whatever it might be. And so I look back now and I'm like, it was unfair for me to call my best mates, show up on weekends with a big smile, hiding part of myself underneath. And, kind of no judgment to anyone doing that now, because it is really, really tough. But I think we have to give men more credit than they get, and that often starts with our male friendships. And that does mean I still go out and we'll still drink and we'll still banter and we'll still talk about sports. I think that stuff's kind of a bedrock of male friendships. But I really, really make an effort to check in on people. I ask them how work's going. They'll tell me they've got a really crappy presentation coming up in 2 weeks' time. I'll make a note and I'll reach out and ask, how did it go, mate? I think just really trying to bring in some of those little small interactions, those small ways of connecting below the surface. I think, they'll start to reflect that back, and that's how we can start to change.
You really mentioned some really interesting things there that I really want to pick on, which is essentially listening, to put it bluntly. But I do feel that a lot of relationships and friendships are very surface level. They could have been built from uni, or they could have been built from football, or they could just be built from people that you worked with. Do you think when you open up, or those people that you do open up to, do you think if you've done that active listening first, that you're in a better position and those people are more likely to be receptive of it? Or do you think it's okay to just open up if you feel they're the right people to open up to?
Do you mean like active listening to yourself, basically? Yeah, I think that if you have done, the conversation will probably be easier, but I don't think it should be a prerequisite, because that active listening is a skill, really. Like, me and you could quickly summarize active listening now, and anyone that has actively listened to this podcast doesn't mean they'll suddenly be completely in tune with themselves and be able to articulate their emotions and all the rest of it. I think often we can be dealing with decades of certain social conditioning here. Like, it sounds really obvious to say, but you have to sort of learn what different feelings feel like in your body, and then it gets really complex, because you'll learn that, for example, excitement and anxiety can feel the same and they operate within the same place. So when you feel really nervous, quote unquote, for that thing, it could actually be excitement, could be a bit of both. It takes time to learn the difference between that, learn how, what your triggers are, how you respond to it, and learn how to articulate it, really. So I think with this stuff, there's a lot of people hurting out there. Everyone's got stuff they're going through. Every time you meet up with your 10 mates, chances are every single one of them's got something going on. I think if everyone waits until they're like an expert in paying attention to the self, it just kicks the conversation down the road. So, sometimes the conversation's messy. I think particularly if people have never spoken about it before, it might come out in a lot of ums and ahs and short words and stop-start phrases. And it might not come out until 3 a.m. in the smoking area in a club when, you've had a few Jaeger bombs. But that's fine, because the conversation is starting. And actually, that was my own experience. Once it got to the point where I had to talk about this stuff, I did. Lo and behold, my mates were going through a bunch of stuff they'd never talked about, which they then started opening up about, often in smoking areas of nightclubs when they were drunk, because it was the only time they felt comfortable doing it. And so then, I proposed back. I was like, why don't we meet up? why don't we meet up with the premise of talking about what's going on for us? Like, let's set that as the goal, because then we've kind of removed the shame and stigma already. So then we met up in a pub, still in the pub with beer. Everyone's a little bit awkward, a bit nervous because we're about to talk about feelings and stuff like that. But we did, and it was incredible. And yeah, it was a lot of broken eye contact, a lot of ums and ahs, lots of, I'm not really sure how I'm feeling. But we all left. There was 4 of us. We all left. We all text each other after in the group you've made, like, God, I feel like a load has been lifted off me.
Yeah.
A weight has come off. I think that's the power of just starting the conversation.
For sure. On that though, do you think there might be a slight barrier? So do you think that sort of looking after your mental health or considering your mental health has a bit of a social economic barrier?
Yeah, I think it does. And this is something really interesting that I found with the book, is that quite often you'll hear phrases like "fuck the patriarchy" or "it's all the patriarchy's fault." And I think men are just broadly painted with this brushstroke of the patriarchy, quote unquote. But actually, someone said something really interesting that stuck with me, that was the spoils of those at the top aren't shared equally by men. And that is so true. A black working class man has already kind of lost the privilege game, and he's towards the bottom of the ladder. He's not feeling the benefit of the patriarchy at the top, or the people in power. And yeah, I think there's a lot of stats that show the disadvantages that people feel further down the ladder, whether that's class or ethnicity. And I don't always think the content we see out online helps that. It's people who are talking about their wicked routine, which, do they even stick to every day? I'm not sure, but the content has you believe that they are. And it's meditation retreats and ashrams and a particular type of coffee blend that, costs a load. It's just not realistic for a lot of people. I think actually it makes people worse, because you see that and you're like, well, I'm not doing enough to look after myself. So I definitely think that there is a barrier to it. And also I would say that not everything has a cost to it, right? So some of the stuff we just talked about, active listening, listen to your body, texting a mate, catching up with a mate, that doesn't cost anything in terms of monetary value. It might cost something in terms of, embarrassment and a feeling of pride or time or whatever, but that is free to sort of access. So I think that, we have to recognize the context people are operating within and acknowledge that. And also, I guess, sort of gently communicate that there are at least some things people can do to manage themselves and their emotions.
Yeah, it's a really grainy sort of topic, I think, because there's a lot of like you say, the privilege and all of these things. And I do a lot of work in Stoke, and to just to prove that it's the case, the Potteries sort of legacy is a men's club at the top of a building, and that is next to the train station that goes directly to London. So it is stone's throw away from the station, and it's very much true that they were there, had their meetings, and got back on the train and disappeared down to London. So the idea that everyone who is born with a penis has benefited from this patriarchal system is ludicrous, and it's quite tiresome. I think it's sort of replaced toxic masculinity. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, whether it's just a new buzzword in a nicer coat.
Yeah, I have a weird relationship with buzzwords like this, because I just think that we love a buzzword, we love a 2-word phrase, and particularly these days with social media, we love to have a hashtag or a viral trend or whatever, and the phrase always gets taken and beaten out of shape and misinterpreted, and we misunderstand it. I think even stoicism, for example, I don't think people always know what that means these days when they say it. I think I've heard people say men should be more stoic, meaning they should just neglect their emotions and not cry or whatever. Whereas actually stoicism is about understanding your emotions so you know how to manage them. It's stuff like that I think gets misinterpreted and misused and whatever. And I think toxic masculinity, for example, probably started with good intentions. I think it's been weaponized now. I think we'll find a new phrase and that will just replace it and get weaponized or whatever. So I try not to get too much into the phrases where I can. It is an easy way of summarizing stuff, and I think people can relate to it. But I think very, very quickly they become boxes and labels that actually people want to push away on. People don't want to be labeled. And the reality is that labels often don't work for humans because we're so complex and there's so much to us. And I think we're so quick to just say, oh, that person is autistic, or that person is disabled, or is black, or does have, is depressed or whatever. And we sort of miss the fact that these are just one part of, much, much bigger picture. So I have a weird thing with relationships labels, where I just think often they do more harm than good.
Yeah, I do agree with that. It's just, like you say, it's just a summary of the world that we live in is where we're at. But I and as you sort of alluded to at the very beginning, is this individualism that people sort of should be aiming for is what we should be looking for as a society, but it is quite hard to do that, I guess. One of the things that we sort of spoke about at the very beginning, to use another sort of phrase, was the Renaissance, as you alluded to it being called. And one of the things that sort of, as men are starting to take care of themselves, as part of that is appearance. You may sort of look at an older guy and say, well, he's out of shape and he's doing what he's doing, but he's lived his life and he can just be that man. Whereas there seems to be a bit of a trend now where men want to take care of themselves a little bit more, both physically and from an appearance point of view. And as part of that, there is sort of new pressures. And I know for yourself, hair loss is one of those pressures. So it'd be great to just sort of touch on that story a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So for context, I've had a hair transplant. I'm 8 months into the journey. So frustratingly, it takes at least 12 months, potentially 18 months to grow. So if you're watching this and you can see a few patches, it's not quite done yet. But yeah, I had a hair transplant, and I did so because of a troubled relationship with my hair and the insecurity and anxiety that gave me. And I think often there's a stigma around men and like looking after themselves, like men wearing makeup, for example. Like even me saying that, I think automatically you feel like a resistance to it.
Yeah.
Whereas, for women, it's not only encouraged, it's kind of expected, and a lot of industries make a lot of money off of that. But I think there's a kind of a perception that men shouldn't care about their appearance, and that maybe they don't care about it as much when it gets criticized or attacked. I think there's kind of a feeling that men just sort of brush it off, which, I mean, it just isn't true. Men have body image issues, body dysmorphia, muscle dysmorphia, eating disorders. These things might present differently. I interviewed someone from my book, Ryan Hopkins, really, really interesting, where he had a really difficult relationship with eating disorders, but it wasn't anorexia. He wasn't making himself really, really stick thin and anorexic. He was trying to sort of bulk up. And actually, he was getting to the point where people were paying him loads of compliments and how amazing he looks, how ripped he looks. On the inside, he was miserable, and he was bulimic. He was making himself sick every night. And so it shows the trouble we can get into, where men are kind of expected to look a certain way and are applauded for it. And actually, under the surface, there can be the same body image issues that women have. It's just not talked about as much. And yeah, for me, that was obviously hair loss. And I think I had to go, kind of coming back to what we said at the start, I had to go through a real journey even with this. And for a long, long time, I cared so much about what other people thought of my hair. And I was just desperate to do anything about it. And now I got the hair loss, hair transplant for me. But I'd be lying if I said that there wasn't an image thing there, and I wanted people to perceive me differently, and there was an insecurity thing there. And I think we are definitely seeing a change with this. I think men's makeup brands are popping up, and I seem to see hair loss content everywhere now. I don't know if that's because I'm kind of looking for it more, but I see it being spoken about more. So I do think that things are shifting, and I do really think it needs to, because, come back to some of the threads we've discussed throughout this, men will go through these things, and where they've probably been taught to feel shame for that and to be emotionally suppressive of that, they'll just push it down. And if they're got an anxiety about their appearance, and they're just pushing that down for 20 years, it doesn't just disappear, and that that builds and builds, and eventually that emotion has to come out somewhere. And if we're not processing it, then it might come out in addiction or a fight or whatever. And I think often we'll be amazed at how many of these things that we see externally, we're quick to sort of judge someone that is an addict or has got in a fight. We don't go deeper and look and actually see that perhaps that person has struggled with their body image for 20 years, and that's how it's presenting. So things are changing, probably not quick enough with this stuff. And yeah, it's definitely conversations we should all be having.
Yeah, I always do dislike the sort of cherry picking when it comes to male issues. Like it's like, well, you can't be concerned about your image because you're a man. But then on the flip side of it, it's like, well, you need to open up emotionally. And it's a bit like, well, why do we have to cherry pick for men if we have this sort of new vision in inverted commas of what masculinity should be? If I'm allowed to be emotional, then I'm allowed to be emotional about the way that I'm dressed. Like that should be okay. But there is still little pockets of it. I mean, some people do say stuff like, well, Wayne Rooney had one, and then you obviously had David Beckham in a sarong, and they were 20 years ago, but they were sort of one-offs, and I'm pretty sure they both got a decent ribbing for it in the papers as well once it happened. George, just sort of to touch on the book a little bit more, it's obviously coming out next year, I believe. What's your big hope for it? What do you hope people get from it?
Hope, I think, is probably the first thing. Like, yeah, the person I held in mind with it when I was writing it was me from 10 years ago, when I just didn't have a clue about any of this stuff. I didn't have a clue about masculinity or mental health issues or whatever it might be. So, I think I haven't wanted to write a book that's encouraging people to meditate and go to ashrams and stuff like that. There's places for that, but I wanted to write a book for men who perhaps don't understand themselves and they're feeling lost and all out at sea, and maybe for women who know that's what the men in their lives are going through. So I want to just give people a book where they can read it and just think, oh, that's me, or I'm going through that, or wow, like I thought I was the only one in the world that felt that way. I think it's hard to maybe just read one book and probably your entire life changes. But if I can give people even just one line that makes them sit up and think, and it makes them reach out to a mate or their partner or whatever, I think for me that's the job done in the book, because that's how stuff starts to change.
Amazing. Well, I hope it does help a George from 10 years ago when it does come out, for sure. But George, in the sort of men's space as a whole, what is it that you really like right now, and what do you want to see more of?
Yeah, I think probably on that thread, really, this is probably why I've gone the route I have with this book. I think real conversations, like real kind of nitty gritty conversations that really get into the weeds. I think that, again, we seem to have a lot of content around stuff like yoga, meditation, whatever it might, those kind of things, which, not knocking them at all. I think they're really, really useful and play their part. But often that stuff is preaching to the converted. Actually, I think a lot of men are stuck stuck with a challenge. Could be hair loss, could be body image, could be erectile dysfunction, could be miscommunication with their partner. They could be lonely, whatever it might be. I think men are often stuck with these issues and feelings that they feel they have no right to talk about, or they don't know how to talk about. And they're just living in that mess, like alone, and not talking about it. So I think the content that's just ripping the Band-Aid off of that and saying, let's talk about porn, let's talk about erections, let's talk about hair, let's talk about body, let's talk about steroid usage, just the ones that I think are just cutting right into where most men are at, is what I would really, really love to see more of, because I think that's how we start the conversation and get people moving down the sort of funnel towards other forms of support.
Amazing. George, it's been an absolute pleasure. It was definitely worth the wait for myself. If people have liked what they've heard and they want to find out more, where is the best place to find you?
Get me on LinkedIn. So just George Bow on LinkedIn. Yeah, that's where I share all my content, and yeah, I share some of those these real conversations. Argument whether LinkedIn is the right place or not for it. I get that comment probably on a daily basis, but that's where I do it.
George, thanks once again, and I'll leave the final thoughts with yourself.
Thank you so much for having me, Lewis. It's been a real pleasure. I'm glad we got it in. And yeah, I think, for anyone listening, man or woman, I guess, just know that things can change. I guess whatever place you're in right now, the brain, it can change. It's called neuroplasticity. You can change your thoughts, change your behavior, change your actions, change the way that you live. So I guess whatever place you're in, there's no sort of pressure to do a certain thing or be a certain way. I'm absolutely not saying you should put the podcast down and then go and find a therapist. I think whatever you're doing right now is the right thing for you, and know that there are other options out there. And yeah, you can live the life that you want to live.